is one that I recently gave in the United States in Washington, D.C. And it basically outlines some of the major issues raised by this extraordinary development. The tar sands are now the world's largest energy project. Their rapid development in the last 10 years poses enormous economic, political, and environmental challenges for Canada, and I'll be exploring and outlining a few of those. Now, if there are any facts here or any particular information that I'm going over that you would like to know what the original or direct source is, I'd be happy to provide that information. And just email me and I'll send you the document. So everything on this slide is in one way or another referenced. So let's begin then. You know, as most of you know, this project is located in northern Alberta. It is the world's largest energy project. It is the world's largest capital project, and it is the world's largest engineering project. Albertans have always considered this resource a critical, highly strategic resource. Back in the 1920s and 1930s, and this is actually a piece of government propaganda that came out in 1932, they were really desperate to try to figure out how to produce this resource, how to get it out of the forest. They referred to it as the magic sand pile. They knew that there was lots of it. They knew it was an incredibly inferior hydrocarbon, and of course, at that time, they still called it the tar sands. And but they were having troubles producing it in an economic fashion. But both Canada and Alberta have been obsessed with this resource for a long time. Now, there are really three deposits. There's the Athabasca deposit, there's the Cold Lake deposit, and the Peace River deposit. You know, these are enormous deposits. At one time, they were light oil. They've been badly biodegraded by bacteria over hundreds of millions of years, with the result that the resource is now this very sticky, viscous hydrocarbon called bitumen. And about 60% of the leases in the province of Alberta have now been leased. Now here's the resource. Industry and government like to refer to it as oil sands. I always challenge audiences to find the oil floating on top of the sand. And the reason you can't find it is because the resource is not light oil. I mean, this is a very unconventional product. Strictly speaking, it has more in common with asphalt than it does any other hydrocarbon. The National Center for Upgrading Technology in Ottawa simply defines bitumen as more than 50% pitch. So, you know, my argument is that if it looks like asphalt, smells like asphalt, and can even be used as asphalt, then maybe it is asphalt. And that's why I use the term tar sands. I think tar sands is a much more honest term. It correctly reflects the high energy, carbon, and water costs of producing this resource. It conveys to both users, consumers, and producers that, look, this is an unconventional product. Whereas oil sands, you know, it's a public relations gimmick. You're trying to convince people that this is accessible, that it is cheap, and that it is light, when in fact it is really truly none of those things. You know, when you shift from conventional to unconventional resources, your economics and your environmental liabilities change considerably. Now here's an example really of the character, very poor character of this product. The American Petroleum Institute grades hydrocarbons by their density and by their type and by their gravity. And as you can see, the bitumen is right at the bottom of the barrel there. It has the lowest gravity, and so it will not move through a pipeline unless you dilute it with natural gas condensate or light oil. Most of the companies working in the tar sands recognize the the extreme nature of the resource. I mean, Total, the French company, even called it an extreme resource. Statoil called it difficult or difficult oil. You know, and I have gone on record calling it dirty oil because of its very high carbon, high water, high capital intensity. Now, bitumen is, again, another indication of how difficult this resource is that it requires extensive upgrading. It is so carbon rich and so hydrogen poor as a result of bacterial activity over tens of millions of years that industry has to, before you can do anything with this product, you have to take some of this carbon out and you have to add hydrogen to it, and that's a process called upgrading. And then after that, the resource requires really complex refining. And the complex refining has to deal with very high acid content, high sulfur content, and a very high content of heavy metals. Now, the resource has been proven so difficult to extract from the boreal forest and so uneconomic for most of this century that in the 1960s, geologists and industry considered a shortcut. And they thought, you know, what would happen if this resource buried under the boreal forest, what would happen if we simply nuked it? Couldn't we just melt it and then produce it like conventional oil? A geologist took the idea to the Alberta government. The Alberta government said, well, that's, you know, that sounds great. They took it to the American government. The American government said, look, we'll give you the bomb. Atlantic Richfield then said, look, we've got a site south of Fort McMurray where you can try this. Fortunately, saner minds prevailed. The Russians, however, did experiment on their heavy oil deposits in Siberia and nuked at least 2 or 3 of them, only to discover that there is yet no global market for radioactive oil. Now, what have been the drivers for the rapid development of this resource? Canada is now producing more than 1.3 million barrels a day from the tar sands, and by 2020 could likely be producing anywhere between 2 to 3 million barrels a day. Some folks have even indicated that the resource could provide by 2030 as many as 11 million barrels a day. That really puts Canada into Saudi Arabia territory right away. So here are the drivers. The first simply is the well-noted decline in light oil production around the world. Basically, light oil production has peaked or is about to peak. This is Colin Campbell, a world-renowned geologist, explaining the phenomenon of peak oil. You start off with, you know, with a full glass, then you're down to half a glass, and before you know it, you're scraping at the bottom of your glass. And this has been an important phenomenon, and I think the rapid development of the tar sands is pretty much a signature that peak oil is very much a reality in the oil world. Another driver, of course, has been the fact that the United States is simply getting tired of the costs of dirty oil. That is, its well-known addiction to light oil from the Middle East has cost the American empire an enormous amount of cash, an enormous amount of lives, and a preoccupation in foreign policy. And they are beginning to think not only about making some transition off bloody oil. There's some thought that dirty oil might provide some relief, but there are a great many people in the U.S. military who would like to get off oil altogether. Another driver, of course, has been the simple fact that Mexico, a really important supplier to the United States, is experiencing rapid depletion in its oil fields. The Cantarell field, one of the world's largest oil fields, is declining on average 30% a year. Then, of course, we've had a lot of salesmen from Canada who've gone down to the United States promoting this resource. Premier Ralph Klein, who ran the province of Alberta for about 14 years, but was known popularly in the province as King Ralph, went down with a very sort of unsophisticated business message, said, look, we've got energy to burn. He's never seen a pipeline that he didn't like. And the Americans said, well, let's sign this guy up before he gets sober. We also had Murray Smith, the former energy minister and ambassador to the United States, explaining the royalty structure for the tar sands as simply we give it away at a 1%. Now, this means that really Alberta's royalty regime is still among, despite all kinds of tinkering in the last 2 or 3 years, is still among the lowest in the world. The U.S. Council on Foreign Affairs has noted, as a number of other really important think tanks, that low taxes and low royalties has really driven the rapid production of this resource. Now, here we are. As a consequence of the development of this resource, Canada is now the #1 supplier of oil to the United States and has been for, close to 8 or 9 years. This phenomenon happened in 2001, 2002. Most Canadians are not aware of this fact, and most Americans are not aware of this fact. Most of the bitumen that Canada is producing is now going to PADD 2, Petroleum Administration District number 2. That's Barack Obama country. 70% of the oil now being consumed in the Midwest is coming from the United States. Some of it's coming from, of course, from Saskatchewan, from heavy oil deposits there, and the rest is coming from Fort McMurray and the tar sands. Of course, the plan is to promote and to expand bitumen pipelines so that eventually almost every pad in the United States would be using bitumen in its fuel refinery mix. Now, a few words about the production of this resource. 20% of the bitumen deposits in Alberta are shallow enough to be mined with open pit mines, and that requires the cutting down of hundreds of thousands of trees, the draining of fens and bogs and waterways, and then you roll up what engineers call the overburden, and you start digging. These are among the world's largest open pit mines. This vehicle here is a 400-ton vehicle, and this gives you a sense of the incredible scale of the project. Again, this is a 400-ton vehicle, and it takes approximately 4 tons of sand and earth to produce 2 tons of bitumen, and it takes 2 tons of bitumen to produce 1 barrel of oil. Every day, Canada is now producing enough, or is now moving enough earth and dirt to fill Yankee Stadium. Some of the mine sites are extraordinary in their scale. This is Imperial's Curl Lake project is now under construction. It will occupy an area of about 70 square miles. And to give you an idea of what that means, here's the city of Seattle. Seattle occupies an area of 92 square miles. So most of these mining operations are occupying a forest base that's similar to many mid-sized North American cities. Now, what is being destroyed in the process, of course, is the boreal forest, a wooded fen that looks like this. And industry and government says that they will restore this landscape. We're really talking about 5,000 square kilometers, so in the end will be sacrificed to open pit mines. They'll restore it to something called equivalent land capability. There are enormous uncertainties about this task and where it's all going, and very little of the land at this point in time has been reclaimed. Now, many companies such as Shell have really based their entire futures on this resource. A third of Shell's remaining reserves are in the tar sands. And they consider this development of this unconventional resource both profitable and sustainable. And that is an issue that got them into trouble in the United Kingdom. The World Wildlife Fund questioned their use of the word sustainable. They said, how can mining a forest be sustainable? The Advertising Standards Authority investigated and said, we concluded that the ad was misleading and that it breached the code for substantiation and truthfulness. So when you have to, get your fuel by digging up a forest and using enormous amounts of water, an incredible amount of capital, 20 times more than what you would use for light oil, you know that what you are doing is truly not sustainable. Now, the other form of production in the tar sands is called steam-assisted gravity drainage. And so 80% of the resource lies too deep in the forest floor to be exploited through open pit mines. So in this process, you are using enormous amounts of natural gas to heat up barrels of water, convert them to steam. Then you're injecting the steam into the ground. You're sort of melting the bitumen as though we're a big block of wax. And then you're collecting the melted bitumen with pipelines underneath and bringing it back to the surface. There are a lot of issues with this form of production in addition to its energy intensity and greenhouse gas intensity. In fact, I mean, this form of production is much more greenhouse gas intensive than the open pit mines. It also fragments the forest floor. This is a typical SAGD project. You've got an idea of the fragmentation from well pads, from pipelines, from seismic lines. And this, of course, is really will be the dominant form of production in about 10 years. And this is when we talk about tar sands production in Alberta occupying an area the size of Florida. It's really what we are talking about are the steam plants. They could essentially industrialize a landscape the size of Florida and northern Alberta. This is just to give you another indication of the fragmentation that will take place. This is a slide developed by the Pembina Institute simulating future development for SAGD developments or in situ developments south of Fort McMurray. Now, as a consequence of this kind of extreme fragmentation, you know, a lot of species will disappear from the region and already are in steep decline, such as woodland caribou and boreal songbirds. And what we're really talking about is the disruption or destruction of habitat for millions of boreal songbirds in this region. The water issues raised by this project are enormous and incredibly important. The project, of course, is located smack dab in one of the world's third largest watersheds, the Mackenzie River Basin. And what happens in this basin, of course, affects areas all the way to the Arctic. And it takes about 3 barrels of fresh water on average to make 1 barrel of bitumen. And this water is largely coming at this point in time from the Athabasca River, which feeds into Lake Athabasca and then eventually into the Mackenzie River. And industry is now using between 2 and 3% of the annual flow of this river. And most scientists have argued that really this kind of consumption is on a collision course with climate change in the region. And since the 1960s, really water levels in the river have dropped by 30%. Now, 90% of the water that is withdrawn ends up in tailings ponds. Now, these tailings ponds are rather an extraordinary development. They're actually the size of lakes. Everyday industry is generating 1.8 billion liters a day of wastewater. These ponds are unlined. They are surrounded by moats because all of them seep, and the seepage is being continually pumped back into these ponds. They occupy now about 130 square kilometers of the forest. These are some of the stuff that you find in these toxic ponds. Incredibly, I mean, this is cancer. These are cancer makers and fish killers. Naphthenic acids, arsenic, benzene, toluene, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, cyanide, lead, and ammonia. Now, industry makes the argument that, well, here's just a graph showing the exponential growth of the tailings ponds since the 1970s. It was known as late as the 1970s that this was not a good way to produce bitumen with this wet tailing process where you are putting the bitumen in essentially large washing machines using caustic soda and hot water to separate the bitumen from the sand and the clay. Recommendations were that you can't have a wet tailings process like this. They were ignored. The ponds were allowed to grow, and really we had no effective criteria for controlling their growth until this year, largely as the product of public outcry from not just Canada but from around the world. Now, a lot of these ponds are located very close to the Athabasca River, and they have been leaking for years into the Athabasca River. This is the Tar Island Dike. This is a Suncor property, and it has been leaking for more than 30 years. The river has essentially been eroding the toe of this dike, and as a consequence, enormous amounts of pollution are beginning into the river. Here's just a scientific slide indicating the seepage into the Athabasca River from this particular dike, which hopefully will be retired sometime this year or next year. Now, the amount of material in the tailings ponds is enormous. According to a former employee of Alberta Environment, there's enough stuff up there to create 300 love canals. It is an enormous liability for both industry and government alike. Communities downstream are enormously concerned about these dikes, and all agree that if one of them were to break, that it would have catastrophic consequences for 40,000 Aboriginal folks living downstream. There are already anecdotal reports about deformed fish catches in the Lake Athabasca. Here's an example. You've got bulging eyes, you've got a curved spine, and you have tumors. And this is an area that has not yet really been adequately investigated either by the Alberta or federal governments of Canada. This position, Dr. John O'Connor has raised really important questions about a number of rare cancers that he has documented in the community of Fort Chip. The Alberta Cancer Board has now confirmed and these cases, and it's indicated that the community actually has a 30% higher cancer rate than would be expected, and that yes, many of these cancers are extremely rare. And again, we need further investigation here to see if these cancers are directly related to pollutants that might be getting into the Athabasca River or into the air from the rapid expansion of the tar sands in the last 10 years. Now here's a really critical issue, and this has to do with something called energy returned on energy invested. So it takes about 1 barrel of oil to create 3 for the steam-assisted gravity development operations, for the steam plants. At one time, it took 1 barrel to produce 20. That's actually still the figure in the Middle East. At the turn of the century, it only took 1 barrel of oil to produce 100. So when civilization is using actually 1 barrel of oil to produce just 1 more, you know that your civilization, which are largely defined by what your fuel economy is or what your energy economy is coming very close to a close. Now the natural fuel of choice for producing bitumen is natural gas, particularly in the steam plants. Consumption is extraordinarily high, and we're now using enough natural gas every day in the tar sands to heat 6 million homes. Here's an interesting comment recently made by Robert Skinner, who now works for Statoil. And he said, "Grandpa, did you really do that? Do what? Did you take natural gas from the Arctic down to Alberta to boil water to make steam to melt tar out of the oil sands, then use more natural gas to produce hydrogen to make the tar molecules into gasoline so North Americans could drive 4-ton vehicles 5 kilometers to sports clubs to spend 15 minutes riding stationary bikes? Did you really do that, Grandpa?" And Robert Skinner, who is an enormously competent fellow, said, "Yes, you know, this is exactly what we're doing." And it's a good illustration of why there has so much an increased global scrutiny of the production of this resource. And certainly the cannibalism of natural gas is a critical issue here. So the Canadian Parliament has actually calculated that to continue production in the tar sands and to accelerate production and to replace natural gas consumption at the same time would probably require on the order something like 20 nuclear reactors. 3 have been proposed, and this raises, again, more questions about the sustainability of this resource. It's one thing to propose using nuclear reactors to diminish fossil fuel production. It's another altogether to use nuclear power to accelerate fossil fuel production. Issues in carbon are increasing and quite dramatic. Industry and government have indicated that, well, on life cycle analyses, really, bitumen has a carbon content or greenhouse gas content about 15% higher than conventional light oil. These studies have been questioned by a number of very prominent scientists, including David Keith at the University of Calgary. They're essentially models, not using real data. The National Energy Technology Laboratory in the United States looked at bitumen as a fuel stock for diesel fuel, and here they did some interesting calculations, and of course they found that really the bitumen is the most carbon intensive of any fuel stock that the United States could be using at this point in time. This will become a really important issue over the next couple of years. Now, tar sands production, again, industry and government have tried to diminish it. They say, it's only 5% of Canada's emissions and very small fraction of global emissions, but this resource is growing rapidly, and by 2020 could be contributing, close to 16 to 20% of Canada's national emissions. That will become a dramatic issue. And at that point, right now, another way to conceptualize the project is producing 36 million tons a year. One way to conceptualize that is that's enough CO2 to fill 76 million homes, and that should actually say here a year. Now, in contrast, here we have the state of Utah producing 32 million tons a year. We've got the tar sands at 36, and soon we'll be in country of about 120 million tons by 2020. Well, that puts us as equivalent to Florida or the state of Ohio. And again, these are issues that are going to spark enormous debate in the United States. Now, you can never do one thing. You can't produce a resource as dirty and capital intensive as bitumen in northern Canada without changing a lot of other things. And so one thing that's happening here is that almost every major oil company, of course, in the world has invested in this resource. And as I mentioned, Shell, a third of its remaining reserves are in bitumen reserves in northern Alberta. So basically, what a lot of these companies are saying is, like, we don't have futures as oil companies unless we produce this resource, and by investing in the tar sands, they are actually really indicating how reluctant they are to make the transition to become energy companies as opposed to oil companies. Now, the rapid development of this resource has also come with rapid development of pipelines, and in fact, we are in the process now of creating excess pipeline capacity in the United States. $30 billion worth of pipelines that are under construction or in the approval process, with the idea of getting bitumen as fast as possible to refineries on the Gulf Coast. And at this point, then, bitumen could be used for export all around the world. There's also talk about building a pipeline to the west coast here with the idea of then exporting bitumen to China. The public policy implications of this, again, are for the North America are really important. Because bitumen is such an unconventional product, refineries in the United States have invested up to $20 billion to date to upgrade and refine this heavy crude. If you're upgrading and refining bitumen, you're adding value to the product because you're then producing gasoline and jet fuel or whatever, and that's where the money is to be made. And because of poor public policy in Canada, this resource is now going to be shipped raw to the United States, where value will be added. And of course, I mean, the continent is now actually running on a resource that is very much, this is an earth-destroying economy. This is a very old-fashioned 19th century approach to running things. And again, when you're running on a fuel that that leaves this kind of legacy and looks like this, you're going to become the target for an enormous number for all kinds of criticism. The tailings ponds legacy, despite new criteria that has been introduced this year by the Alberta government, is still a really extraordinary, outstanding legacy and threat to the Mackenzie River basin. The more money that has been invested in tar sands, the less and less that Canada has really invested in renewables. Unlike Europe, we are really been an extraordinarily poor player when it comes either to investing in renewables, providing research for renewable technology, or for critical action on climate change. The exploitation of this resource, of course, is also disrupting an extraordinary amount of carbon storehouses, particularly peatlands. Most of the open pit mines, 50% of that activity is really taking place on peatland, which is, by and large, the world's largest and best sequester of carbon. And so we're not only actively disrupting those ecological services, but at the same time then burning the resource and creating more greenhouse gases. And I think this is why the resource has become such a sore point and such a metaphor for everyone, for everything that people think have gone wrong at this point in time. This is a slide from James Hansen. James Hansen, of course, is the NASA scientist and perhaps the leading authority on climate change in the United States. And here he kind of defines the basic conflict, and this is very much it. We have fossil fuel interests in the tar sands saying, look, we have every right to develop this fuel, and we really believe that the world needs more of it, and without of it, we're not going to be able to enjoy our standard of living. And then we have young people saying, you know what, we could really enjoy a good standard of living consuming 2/3 less fuel and consuming the same amount as Japan and Europe, and at the same time, we really need to think about future generations and climate change. There's a public health legacy here emerging that is not well defined, not well studied. These are all images of people who have died of cancer in the community of Fort Chip downstream from the tar sands. And this is Chief Ansel Adams. This is an issue that needs to be properly accounted for. There are many point sources of pollution on the Athabasca River, but the tar sands is rapidly becoming one of the most dominant ones. The issue of using nuclear power for fossil fuel production is problematic, and yet it is one actively being pursued by many players in the tar sands. For the United States, the really critical issue here is that they've been stuck in the sand in Saudi Arabia and in petropolitics there. Switching their fuel stock or fuel supply or oil supply to Canada. Well, Canada is friendly. There's lots of great things about Canada, but in the end is switching to a hydrocarbon that's 20 times more capital intensive than light oil, 3 times more carbon intensive than light oil. Is that really going to provide the United States with the kind of energy security it needs? And increasingly, a number of prominent people in the U.S. military, including Vice Admiral Dennis McGinn, have made the argument, you know what, we just need to get off this resource altogether if the United States really wants true energy security. I've often made the argument as an Albertan and as a citizen of this province that we've really developed the resource too quickly. Former Premier Peter Lougheed has made exactly the same argument, I think much more eloquently than myself, and he said, really, we need to slow down. We need to extract a fair price from this resource for the people of Alberta. We need to behave like owners, and we haven't really done that. We've just sort of assumed the market can take and do whatever it pleases. And so, I mean, everyone wants progress, but if you're on the wrong road, progress means doing an about turn and walking back to the right road. And in that case, the man who turns back soonest is the most progressive. Well, here the big question is will that man or woman actually be an American, a Canadian, or a European? Now, I'd be pleased at this point then to answer your questions, and I hope I can can work the audio here to do that in a good way. Thank you.
I received an email from Dr. Bob Stewart in Scotland, who unfortunately couldn't participate today. He wanted to say that from good analysis, the average Canadian citizen uses 25 liters of oil per day. In the UK, the average is 12.5, and his own is 1.8 liters per day, including transportation. You're developing the tar sands to support a heavy need to purposely waste energy, and everyone should try their best in order to reduce their oil consumption.
Well, I think that's a very good point. It's another indication whenever you compare fossil fuel consumption in Canada to Japan or to Europe, you begin to understand how extravagant our consumption is. Now, we also live in a cold climate, but so do people in Scotland. But we're extraordinarily large countries, so there is some room there for extra consumption. But by and large, a lot of our consumption is extraordinarily wasteful. We're running vehicles that are really not appropriate most of the time, and so we're not really providing any energy security. By developing this resource as rapidly as we have, we're essentially allowing people to lead extravagant and wasteful lives that they won't be able to sustain for much longer. And then there's some real moral questions here. The average Canadian consumes six times more energy than an individual in China. And I guess the question is, do we have a God-given right to do that? And how much longer will we be able to do that?
Yes, go ahead, Catherine.
I was just wondering what kind of regulations there are in place for things such as the huge tailings ponds and what the major oil companies have to do once they're finished with the land.
Hi, Catherine. The Alberta government has introduced a new set of regulations this year for the tailings ponds. And essentially, these regulations will, if they are effectively adopted over time, and there's a great deal of question about that, it would really force the companies to move to a dry tailing process so that they could no longer dispose of their water waste in these tailings ponds. So by 2015, with the new guidelines from the Alberta government, companies will essentially have to stop producing this form of waste. That does not address the legacy of the existing ponds, which now cover approximately 130 square kilometers of land all along the Athabasca River. And really, we need a set of regulations that says that water must be treated, must be purified, and then perhaps put back in the river. But we haven't seen that yet, and there is the risk of these tailings ponds either leaking into groundwater or into the Athabasca River, or the catastrophic risk of one of these dikes actually breaking. So that's the one issue. In terms of reclamation, there are many issues here. Restoring the boreal forest so far has proven a very difficult task, given the materials at hand. we're probably looking at only 50% of the original biological diversity, even if we achieve that. A lot of the new species that would be used on these reclaimed landscape will have to be salt tolerant. They have to be salt tolerant because of the material being used for reclamation, which comes from a lot of it from the tailings ponds, and a lot of it is very heavy in ammonia and so on. So that's one issue. Another issue, so the success of reclamation really is uncertain at this point in time. The second issue is that industry, according to the Auditor General of Alberta in a recent report, has not set aside enough money for reclamation in terms of security deposits. That's another issue. A third issue comes down to reclaiming boreal wetlands and peatlands. Remember, 50% of what is being disturbed, or more than 50%, are boreal forests, are boreal wetlands and peatlands. And really, at this point in time, nobody knows how to reclaim those really important ecosystems and services. And the idea is to instead kind of populate the area with something called in-pit lakes. So you'll take a lot of water from these tailings ponds, put them in old mining pits, cover it with fresh water, and hope that over time, Mother Nature will make this water less toxic. It's a completely unproven kind of program, and another indication of how quickly this resource has been developed without proper environmental safeguards put in place, or even proper research having been done. Again, the U.S. Council on Foreign Affairs has noted that the Alberta government which has been in power for 38 years, is extremely skeptical of environmental management. So these environmental issues, whether it's dealing with the tailings ponds or dealing with reclamation, have not been properly resolved at this point in time. They remain outstanding issues.
Any other questions? Yes, Catherine, you have another question?
Yeah, okay, one more for me. I was just wondering, as you mentioned in your presentation, this whole process isn't a very sustainable one, and obviously has huge implications on not only Canada and the local communities in a negative sense, but also the entire world through the emissions release. How do you suppose that this can kind of be slowed down so that it's not on that quickly developing pathway? Is it up to the government? Is it up to the public outcry? Is it up to the large oil companies? Like how can we stop this momentum?
That's a good question, Catherine. Really, it's up to government at this point in time to put their foot on the brakes, and they can do that a number of ways. To date, the Alberta government has indicated that they don't want to put their foot on the brake, and that they're quite comfortable driving a vehicle without brakes. The most important brake that both the government of Alberta and the federal government have are royalties and corporate taxes on the resource. Again, as I noted, the U.S. Council on Foreign Affairs has indicated that the rapid development of this resource has in part been driven by the very low and poorly managed royalty regime in Alberta, and also by low corporate taxes at a federal level. And so simple fiscal change in terms of higher royalties for bitumen, as well as higher corporate taxes, would dramatically slow down the development of this resource. Ultimately, that would be good for everybody. It would be good for industry, because right now industry has developed too much too quickly, and has not completely calculated the real carbon liabilities that they are now responsible for here. So that if the world does get serious about climate change and puts a very high price on carbon, then that's going to dramatically affect their production, because there really are no real ways at this point in time to diminish carbon production in the tar sands other than simply slowing down. So a slowdown would be good for any number of reasons, but really the easiest way to do that is for both the Alberta government and the federal government to exercise some sort of public and moral authority over the resource by saying, look, it's not in the interests of Canada, it's not in the interests of the globe to develop this resource as quickly as we've done in the last 10 years. So taking the money off the table, creating a sovereign fund in Canada, raising royalty rates in Alberta, those are probably the best fiscal tools we have for slowing down production. Another would be to tax natural gas use in the tar sands. And right now, natural gas use in the tar sands can be deducted from capital costs as a cost of production, with the result that industry can use just about as much natural gas as it wants for bitumen production at no cost to itself and at considerable cost to Canadian taxpayers. That's a loophole that really needs to be closed.
Any other questions from anyone? Yes, Catherine?
So just in response to your response, I was wondering how or if you foresee the Albertan and Canadian governments doing this. Would they just go ahead and do it? Obviously, there are lots of different interests in continuing to produce oil out of the tar sands, relations with the United States, betterment of our economy, lots of other concerns that sometimes push away those environmental matters. So do you foresee the Albertan government and the Canadian government actually taking the necessary approach and action towards it?
Well, again, that's a good follow-up, Catherine. You know, what really has to happen first is that there has to be a national debate in Canada about the pace and scale of this project and what Canada hopes to achieve by developing this project. And until we have that national debate, and that's not just a debate about the environmental issues or the economic issues. This project now employs, you know, 250,000 people in the country, will generate, you know, $1 trillion to the GDP by 2020. But we have to look at all of the issues, and there has to be the debate about, okay, well, what's going to happen to our economy if this becomes a central driver for our economy? What's going to happen to Canada if Canada continues on this path of being a carbon bully? And what's going to happen in the United States as Americans become more and more ask more and more critical questions about the carbon content of their fuels? So, you know, before we can have a slowdown, before governments can even use the fiscal tools that they have at their disposal to slow this project down, really Canadians have to decide where they want to go with it. And it's not clear to me that Canadians either want to speed up or either want to slow down. And most Canadians really are terribly poorly informed about this project, and they don't understand how dramatically it has changed Canada. They you know, very few Canadians fully realize that we now have a petroloonie, that our dollar goes up and down with the price of oil. Very few understand what that means to our manufacturing sector. and how difficult it is becoming to export products from Canada as a result of the rapid development of this resource. Then there are the carbon liabilities and Canada's international reputation abroad in terms of climate change action. Then there are the whole issues of supporting other sectors in the economy for renewables and renewable innovation, which we have totally neglected and have made extremely difficult for a lot of this to happen. But you can't go anywhere with any of this until the country actually behaves like an adult and has a civilized debate about the pros and cons of rapidly developing this resource. To date, we have simply assumed that the rapid development of the resource is what the market wants, and if what the market wants, that it can't be bad and can only be good for Canada, and we have ignored the economic, political, and economic liabilities and environmental liabilities of rapidly developing the resource. And I really can't see any way of addressing any of those issues without a national debate.
Okay, so if there are no other questions, then we would like to take this opportunity to thank Andrew for presenting this webinar for the Safe Drinking Water Foundation. Excellent job with the new software, Andrew, and excellent presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. It was my pleasure. And if you do have any follow-up or further questions, or you're looking for particular documents, please don't hesitate to send me an email, and I'll do the best I can. Thank you.
Perhaps then, Andrew, you would like to give everyone your website address and your email address. Is that correct? Thank you, everyone, for taking the time to participate. Excellent questions, excellent discussion. Have a great day.